Now we're going to look at the different types of behavioural research design that could potentially be used in program evaluation. So I'm going to be talking more about program evaluation during the course because this is one of the things that you're quite likely to be asked to do in one form or another when you actually get out into the workplace. In the course we'll be giving some examples of that you might even find yourself having to do as part of placements in fourth year or if you go into one of our master's programs. What is program evaluation? So I'm using it in a very broad sense of the word, where the program we could be talking about evaluating some clinical therapy, we could be talking about evaluating some training course, we could be talking about evaluating some government scheme. So I'm just using the term really broadly. It's also worth pointing out that program evaluation goes way beyond the sort of behavioural research that we're talking about here. So if you just look up program evaluation on Wikipedia, you can see that it covers all sorts of different sorts of aspects of programs that you might want to evaluate. But here we're going to focus on the bit that psychologists might be asked to do, that is to see the sort of behavioural outcomes of particular programs. So I'm going to talk about 4 different types of research design that are commonly used in this sort of evaluation. So first is using experiments or randomized control trials to measure program outcomes. So I guess I'm usually referring to here is participant behaviour. So that is, for example, you do some therapy on some patients, on some clients, and then you evaluate whether their behaviour improves in the direction you want it to following that sort of intervention. And what you would do is compare that with some control group, where the crucial thing here is that whether people end up in the control group or in the treatment group or in the program group, that allocation has to be completely random. And that's very important because that leads us to the main advantage of using this sort of experimental design, which is that you can evaluate causation. You can make statements that, this program definitely caused this benefit. So why don't we just use experiments for all of our research? Well, a number of disadvantages. So one is that it can be very expensive, very time consuming. And another one is it's simply, in a lot of situations, it's simply impossible, or at the very least, just impractical. Okay, second type of design is what we often call quasi-experiments or natural experiments, for evaluating program outcomes like participant behaviour. So just like experiments, we would be having a treatment group and a control group, but the difference here is that whether you end up in the control group or the treatment group is not random. So an advantage of a quasi-experiment is that it simply might be possible in some situations where running a true experiment is not possible, or at least is impractical. However, the disadvantage is that now we can't be absolutely certain of causation. So that is, the program outcomes could be due to something other than the program itself because we haven't done that random assignment. Third type of design, quantitative surveys, asking about people's opinions of the program. And by quantitative, I mean something that's going to give us a score, a number at the end. So a classic example of that would be CCAT ratings, where you rate your courses on 1 to 5 scales. Advantage of this is that you usually get pretty big sample sizes because we can collect this data in a fairly automated way. Larger sample sizes means we may also get a more representative. Disadvantages of this sort of survey approach compared with experiments and also the quasi-experiments is that we can't be sure that the real effect of a program, because people's insights or opinions about that program may not be true. So in this survey we're asking people what they thought of the program or the course. We can ask them whether they thought it improved them or not. But what we know from a lot of research in psychology is that often, first of all, it could be that people just don't have any insight into whether they've improved or not improved, or what's helped them or not helped them. And the second thing is that even if they do have insight, they might have other reasons why they might not want to be forthcoming about it. Okay, the fourth type of design, qualitative research. So what I'm talking about here are things where you do focus groups. You get a bunch of people in a room, you ask them open-ended questions, and you get them to sort of give you verbal responses, have a discussion about the whatever it is you're evaluating, so your program or whatever. You could do that, or you could have interviews with participants or stakeholders. You could have consultations with subject matter experts. So an example of this would be the written response section of your CCAT forms. So big advantages of this sort of research. So typically it's cheaper than other types of research. You just have to grab a bunch of people and ask them some questions and write down what they say. It can give you some insights into people's opinions of the program that you might be difficult to get through any of the other methods. But it does come with significant disadvantages. So that is, if this is all you're going to do, first up, you, just like with the quantitative survey, you can't be sure of the real effect of a program, because first up, people's insights may simply not be true into that program, and secondly, maybe that even if they've got the insight, maybe they might not be forthcoming about these insights when you ask them for various reasons. Second disadvantage is that compared with our quantitative surveys, we're generally using smaller samples because we can't use that sort of automatic sort of online surveys with numerical responses. We're getting people to type things, which means when you analyse them, you have to do a lot more interpretation of those results. So we tend to have smaller samples for these sorts of things. That might mean that our results could be subject to bias, could be less representative. And because we have to interpret what people say, there's a greater level of subjectivity in this sort of data. Okay, so now let's look at an example of each of these four types of design. Let's talk about experiments first, or randomized control trials. Okay, so let's say our research question is that we've created some sort of hazard perception training intervention for drivers. Many of you will have done the hazard perception test that you need to go from a provisional 1 to a provisional 2 licence in Queensland, and as I'll be endlessly banging on about during the course, I created that hazard perception test, and we've created hazard perception training to go alongside that test, which we're currently doing a lot of research on. So one of the key questions that I'm always interested in is, does this hazard perception training actually improve hazard perception test scores, and as a result hazard perception during real driving? So this is a sort of study that we're currently running and comes in lots of different forms, but here's just one example for you. So what we might do is recruit a load of drivers, give them a hazard perception test. So this measures their hazard perception in driving. So this test involves, if you weren't familiar with this, I'm going to give you, I will show you some examples during the course. Typically involves though drivers watching videos of real driving, filmed from the driver's point of view, and they have to click on any road users that might be involved in a traffic conflict, sort of a situation with the camera car, where the camera car has to take evasive action to avoid a collision. Okay, so the score is literally how early you can anticipate these potentially dangerous situations, and that score predicts your crash rate, and also predicts how many other things, like how often that you slam on your brakes during real driving. So it's a pretty well validated test. Okay, then we take that group and we randomly allocate them to either receive our hazard perception training, which is designed to improve their hazard perception, or they get assigned to some placebo control group which doesn't get the hazard perception training, but maybe they get some other sort of driver training not related to hazard perception, just to get that placebo effect. Then when you've either got your training or got your placebo, then you get a second hazard perception test. We will then maybe wait a month and then test them again, and maybe wait 3 months, test them again, to see whether any effects of, if we get an immediate effect of training, is that effect still there after 1 month, and is it still there after 3 months? And the idea is that the data from an experiment like this, if we can show that people improve who've received the training, then we can be very certain of the causation. We know that it's the training that's caused that improvement rather than some other effect. Right, so in your own words, list 4 methods you could use to conduct a behavioural evaluation of some program or intervention. So you can just list those 4 methods that we mentioned on the previous page. So experiment, an experiment, a quasi-experiment, a quantitative survey or qualitative survey. What are the advantages and disadvantages of using a randomized control trial to evaluate some program or intervention? So advantages is that we can establish causality. That is, we can be sure that if there's any benefit from shown in the data, then that benefit is due to the program or intervention. Disadvantages is that it's often not practically possible to do a randomized control trial in many situations, and these things are it's usually a big deal to run them. They can be pretty expensive. Third question, give an example of an experimental design for evaluating the effects of some program. Well, I've just given you an example here with hazard perception training. So all you have to do is, off the top of your head, come up with some substitute for hazard perception training. Okay, let's think, face recognition training. So ability to sort of maybe remember unfamiliar faces. We would need a test of ability to remember unfamiliar faces. We would need some training program to help people remember unfamiliar faces, and then we would be able to run an experiment like this. Second type of the design was the quasi-experimental or natural experiment. Okay, so here's a sort of research question. So imagine that you've been recruited by the government, you work for the Department of Transport and Main Roads in Queensland, and as a psychologist, and you're asked to evaluate the Queensland graduated licensing scheme. Okay, so yeah, this is a real example. This is exactly the sort of thing that sort of psychology graduates do in the real world. And so the question is, does the Queensland graduated licensing scheme reduce crash risk compared with what was done previously? What they did here is they looked at all the data from when the scheme was introduced in 2008, and they looked at the data from all the people who got their provisional licence and followed up their sort of the number of reported crashes that they had over a number of years. And then for their control group, they looked at people who got their driving licence the years before this graduated licensing scheme was brought in. So this means that you've got 2 groups, one group that's gone through the graduated licensing scheme and one group who hasn't gone through the graduated licensing scheme. But this is not a true experiment, this is a quasi-experiment, because there isn't random assignment between the 2 groups. But we've got our 2 groups, and then we survey how many crashes they have following this. So the advantage of this is that, well, it's doable in the sense of, to do this sort of study as a true experiment would be really, really, really hard. So there would be the practical issues. So we're talking about tens of thousands of people who are going through this licensing scheme. But you've also got the ethical issue of to actually do your random assignment. If you've got grounds to think that this graduation licensing scheme is going to reduce crash risk, can you be justified in withholding it from, for example, half your population in order just to run the study? Okay, so ethical issues, there's practical issues, therefore the idea is this is considered a reasonable substitute. But the disadvantage we've introduced is that we can't be absolutely sure that if there's a difference between our 2 groups, and there is a difference, so that is under the graduated licensing scheme, novice crashes have reduced by about 13% per year, which is great, but we can't be 100% certain that that's due to the scheme, because It could be due to some other factor that changed between 2007 and 2008. So one possibility is that there was the global financial crisis occurred just after 2008, and so it could be possible to argue that maybe people got really poor after that year, therefore they couldn't afford cars, they couldn't afford petrol, and therefore they didn't drive around as much, and therefore they crashed less. So it's possible to make arguments like that. Probably not true, but the point is we can't 100% rule it out. Okay, so in your own words, what are the advantages and disadvantages of using a quasi-experimental design to evaluate some program or intervention? So the advantages are often much more practical than compared with a true experimental design, and we're still getting most of the benefits of a true experimental design in terms of being able to come up with convincing evidence to see whether the program is doing what we want it to do. The big disadvantage is that we can't be 100% certain of the underlying causal mechanism behind our results. Give an example of a quasi-experimental design for program evaluation. Okay, so with all these, when I say give an example, it doesn't have to be a real example, just make it up off the top of your head. So here's one example for you. Let's say, we want to find out whether putting kids in kindergarten has an effect on how they perform in prep when they go to school. So we could run that as a quasi-experiment by getting a bunch of kids who've gone to kindergarten, and then we get a bunch of kids who haven't gone to kindergarten, and of course we want to try and match them for as many different variables as possible, because it could just be that kids have gone to kindergarten, maybe parents have just got a bit more money or something like that, so there'll be lots of other things that distinguish them. So we want to control for as many of those other variables as possible, and then we've got our two groups, and then we'll follow up their outcomes in prep to see the results. That's the sort of study that would be really hard to do as a true experiment, because you can't just take kids and randomly say, you get to go to kindergarten, and you can't. In the real world, that'd be very, very hard to do, both ethically and practically. Third type of experimental design, a quantitative survey of stakeholders' opinions. So, so let's say research question is, to what extent was Psych 30/20 an effective course? So you do your CCATs, you answer a bunch of questions that you respond to on a numerical scale, 1 to 5, and basically I get all that data after the end of semester and can get a sense of to what extent that you believe that this course was any good or not. Okay, so we recruit a sample of people who have experienced the program, i.e. it could be you guys at the end of semester, and then we get you to do an online survey telling us what you thought about it using these multiple choice type responses. In your own words, what are the advantages and disadvantages of using a survey of stakeholders' opinions to evaluate some program or intervention? So, advantages is that it's much easier to do this than any of the quasi-experimental or experimental ways of evaluating performance. Okay, so I have done that for courses as well, but obviously that's the hard bit there is getting an appropriate control group. Okay, so much easier just to basically ask you what you thought. Okay, but the disadvantages are that with a survey like this, it does rely on whether the stakeholders actually have sufficient insight as to what makes an effective course or doesn't make an effective course. Finally, we have our qualitative opinion-based evaluations. So this is the more open-ended responses rather than the sort of numerical responses where people either sort of freely write what they thought about a certain thing or tell you verbally what they sort of thought about a certain thing. So maybe we could convene a focus group, or we could get you to do some sort of survey where you have an open-ended response. So all we have to do for this is recruit a sample of people who've experienced the program or have some sort of knowledge of it, and then get them to talk about or write about what they thought of it. So, in your own words, what are the advantages and disadvantages of using this sort of qualitative, opinion-based approach to evaluating some program or intervention? So, advantages are it's really easy to run this sort of thing. Requires much less effort, much less expense than pretty much all the other methods. It also has the advantage that sometimes you can get insights that you might not get through other methods because of the open-ended nature of the responses. However, the disadvantages are that at the end of the day it is just an opinion-based thing, so it relies on people being articulate enough to be able to tell you what they're thinking, and it relies on them having sufficient insight into whether the course is working or not working. Right, give an example of a qualitative opinion-based approach to program evaluation. Well, when I designed the current version of Psych 3020, I actually convened a working group of students, 3 students, one who had done a previous version of Psych 3020 and graduated, one who had started that previous version, dropped out and then was going to do the new version, and then one student who was going to do the new version. And we had weekly meetings where I discussed all of the innovations and new things I was going to bring to the course and asked their opinions of it, so that basically the course you're doing now is actually pretty heavily influenced by what the insights that those students gave me, which were immensely valuable. Right, that's the end of this online refresher presentation. I hope you found it useful, and make sure that you can answer all of the questions in those blue boxes on all the different slides, and also go into Question Hoard and make sure you can answer all the questions there and study the feedback. So bearing in mind that of course in the actual quizzes I'll be sort of tweaking the wording of those things, so don't get caught out by that. And yeah, if you have any questions about that presentation, then feel free to talk to me during our workshops or drop me an email. Thanks very much for listening.